predicting every NFL team's final record based on the regular season schedule. AFC South. AFC South. Interesting division. Some of these teams may be going through it this year. And we'll start with the Houston Texans. AFC South, Houston Texans, what do you got for me in the regular season? I'll tell you right now. Baltimore week 1, they lose. Week 2 against Indy, they lose. Week 3 against Jacksonville, they lose. Week 4 against Pittsburgh, they lose. They get their first win of the season on week 5 against the Atlanta Falcons. Week 6 against the New Orleans Saints, they lose. At Carolina, week 8, battle of 1 and 2 overall draft picks, they beat Carolina. They lose to Tampa Bay in week 9. They lose to Cincinnati in week 10. Arizona, they beat them. Jacksonville, they lose in week 12. They lose to Denver in week 13. They lose to New York in week 14. They lose to Tennessee in week 15. They beat Cleveland in week 16. They lose to Tennessee in week 17. And they beat the Indianapolis Colts in week 18. So to recap, the losses are Baltimore, Indy, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Tampa Bay, Cincinnati, Jacksonville again, Denver, New York, Tennessee, and that's it. So 12 losses for the Houston Texans this year puts them at 5-12. I think CJ Stroud looks okay, but ultimately their offensive line is not great. Their defense is not great, and they'll beat the bad teams, but they will compete. They might sneak a couple of sneaky victories here and there. I am very intrigued about that week 8 matchup at Carolina against Bryce Young. That'll be a really cool game to watch, but ultimately 5-12 for the Houston Texans, I think is pretty comfortable. Up next is the Indianapolis Colts in the AFC South. Don't ask me why Indianapolis, one of the more northern cities in the country, is located in a division labeled the South. That is neither here nor there. Week 1 against Jacksonville, they beat them. Week 2 against, oh no, I'm sorry. Let me start over. Week 1 against Jacksonville, that's a loss for the Colts. Week 2, they beat Houston. Week 3, they lose to Baltimore. Week 4, they lose to the Rams. Week 5, they lose to Tennessee. Week 6, they lose to Jacksonville. Week 7, they beat Cleveland. Week 8, they lose to New Orleans. Week 9, they beat Carolina. Week 10, they beat New England. Then they lose to Tampa in week 12. They lose to Tennessee in week 13. They lose to Cincinnati in week 14. They lose to Pittsburgh in week 15. They beat Atlanta in week 16. They beat Vegas in week 17, and they beat Houston in week 18. That is a 7-10 record for the Indianapolis Colts this year. I think that's legitimate. I think that's fair. I like Anthony Richardson. I like their defense. It's always a really competitive defense in Indianapolis, but I think 7-10 is very fair, very marginal. It's going to be, again, a plus or minus 1 or 2 wins there, but the Colts are not going to be in competing for a playoff spot. Let's just say that. Okay. Moving on in Jacksonville in the AFC South. Everyone's high on the Jags this year, and guess what? So am I. Let's go. Jacksonville Jaguars schedule 2023. Indianapolis week 1, dub. They lose to Kansas City in week 2, no problem. 1-1. They beat Houston in week 3. They beat Atlanta in week 4. They're gonna lose to Buffalo in week 5. They beat let's see, Indianapolis in week 6. Okay, wait, yeah. So back up again. They beat Indy in week 1. They lose to Kansas City. They beat Houston. They beat Atlanta. They lose to Buffalo. They beat Indianapolis. They beat the New Orleans Saints. They lose to Pittsburgh in week 8. Week 9 bye, just absolutely perfect. Dead central. They lose to San Francisco. At home against Tennessee, they beat them. They beat Houston again. They lose to Cincinnati. They beat Cleveland. They lose to Baltimore. They beat Tampa Bay. They beat Carolina. And then they lose to Tennessee. That, to recap what their losses of the year, is Kansas City, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, 1 loss to Tennessee, Cincinnati, and I got them at 11-6. I think 11-6 for the Jags this year. Trevor Lawrence comes into his own. All things considered, it's going to be a good year for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm high on them, 11-6. I might have messed that up somewhere. If they're not 11-6, they're 10-7. Either way, they're in the playoffs, and they're going to win that division, I think. Last but not least, in the AFC South, okay, we've got Tennessee Titans schedule. Tennessee Titans, always an interesting club. right? Mike Vrabel knows what he's doing. He knows how to coach a team. Quarterback situation is a little bit foggy, but you got Derrick Henry. So let's run through it. Tennessee in week 1 against New Orleans, that's a win. They play the Chargers in week 2, loss. Cleveland, week 3, win. Cincinnati in week 4, loss. Indianapolis in week 5, win. Baltimore week 6, loss. 3-3 through 6 games, week 7 bye. Atlanta, week 8, they win. Pittsburgh in week 9, they lose. At Tampa Bay in week 10, win. At Jacksonville in week 11, loss. Carolina week 12, win. Indianapolis week 13, win. At Miami week 14, loss. Houston week 15, win. Seattle week 16, loss. Houston week 17, win. Week 18 against Jacksonville, loss. That puts them at 9-8. Tennessee Titans, seems like every single year they're a 9-8 ball club, but they're not going to win the division. They're solid enough just with Derrick Henry, Mike Vrabel, and the defensive presence in Tennessee to get 8 or 9 wins. I have them at 9-8 coming into this year. I think that's respectable. I think that's expected. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. So to recap the AFC South, I think we had Jacksonville at 11-6. We had Tennessee at 9-8. We had the Colts at 7-10. And I think we had Houston at 4-13, right? I think that's about right.